Okay, hello there everybody. Welcome to this Hort Innovation Insights webinar. Through the Insights webinar series, we're looking to unpack current areas of interest and concern for the horticulture sector through connecting and exploring topics of interest with key experts that we engage with through the initiatives we work on here at Hort. And the purpose of the webinars are really to help unpack some of the key takeaways that relate to these topics of interest, which we can hope you can take back to inform your business or your other practice. So my name is Adam Briggs and I'm the Head of Data and Insights at Hort Innovation. I've been with Hort for around 4.5 years and work to ensure that the industry and the sector has access to the latest data and information to inform our investments and also to inform decision making at an industry level and also at a farm level. And I might be a familiar face for those of you who joined us on the first webinar where we looked at the consumer market environment. But today we're going to be building off that initial discussion and taking a bit of a pivot to look at some of the current environment and some of the impacts we're seeing for the food service sector, and also to consider some of the signals as we move to a state of recovery for that sector. Now today I'm joined by Martin Kneebone, and Martin's the Managing Director at Fresh Logic. So g'day Martin, how are you doing today?
Hi Adam.
Thanks for being with us today.
It's all right, welcome to the chance, it's good.
Thank you. Martin's worked with us at Hort for a number of years as a delivery partner for the Hort Stats Handbook, which I'm hoping that most of you on the call are familiar with. And Martin, I might be a bit biased, you might be a bit biased, but I think it's been a pretty successful resource and probably one of the more enduring investments that we've been able to undertake here at Hort. But the handbook aside, Fresh Logic also deal with a range of other market intelligence and research, and that extends to food service. Martin, maybe by way of introduction, it'd just be great to get a quick rundown of Fresh Logic's service and how that extends to food service.
Sure. We set ourselves, Adam, to cover the whole food expenditure from the household. So early on, that meant designing our systems to capture food spent out of home and food purchased to be prepared at home. That naturally captures food service, and I suppose that was a big call 10, 12 years ago, and it's proved to be revealing in terms of, I suppose, patterns and trends, because over that time, the household expenditure on food service has increased. So we track that share of stomach measure. We look into the detail of what's going on in retail and preparation. We also into the detail of which food service channels are being patronised, and particularly the switch between the two. And in the last 3-4 months, we've had probably the sharpest extremes of those switches to, I suppose, try and assess would be the best way to put it. So we run consumer panels, and we run pretty sophisticated modelling engines up and down the supply chain to quantify that out to give people sort of the volumes and the values, which is what they generally need to make the big decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sounds good. And I'm certainly very familiar with everything you guys are involved in, but yeah, it's great just to get that sort of orientation. And before we jump into things, I'll just cover off on a quick bit of housekeeping. So for those of you who participated in the previous webinar, we did feature a bit of a Q&A session towards the second half of that session, and we're going to be also looking to do that today as well. So you'll notice there on your dialogue screen, there's an icon at the bottom, which is called Q&A. So I'd encourage you throughout the time that we're here today for you to lodge any of your questions that you'd like to ask either of us today, and we'll get to those towards the second half of the session. So that's just worthwhile knowing there. Now, I think it's probably just worth us spending some time to orient ourselves with what we actually mean by food service and sort of where we're at. So Martin, I know you've got some perspectives to share with us soon, but just to start maybe with some basics around defining the food service sector. is it just as simply a matter of considering it to be representative of any kind of food product or channel that consists of food being consumed outside of the home? Is it as simple as that, or how do you approach defining the sector?
At a headline level, yes, but it's probably better to understand the sub-channels beneath that. I think of the three groups broadly. We've got dining out or takeaway, where most of the action is. We've got food consumed in travel and events. And then we've got food consumed through what we call institutional, which might be health, aged care, education, and workplace, and so on. So they're quite different places, but the common denominator in all of them is that food is prepared and consumed out of the home. So, right, yes, but probably helped by a little bit more detail.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that's good. So three core pillars there, and where, just in terms of the hort sector, so where does the hort sort of sector fit within this supply chain? Because obviously food services taking on a range of inputs.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what characterises the hort sector as a supplier into that?
Well, I mean, hort product, like it is everywhere, is a short life perishable. So it's going to have shorter supply lines. It's going to have shorter order lead times because of the sensitivity of the product. And in general, it flows a couple of ways. It can flow to the more organised buyers through tendering, sort of long-term arrangements, or the casual buyers, or those that might experience changes in demand, often source product through the central market infrastructure, through providors who can help them with the 40 or 50 categories of product that they might be supplying. I mean, food service is generally very, very closely aligned with the logistical provider, and often the two are one, and that's a reflection of the sensitive nature of the product. Now, it stands alone from some other products in food service. Some of the bigger providers combine it, but whereas a lot of other products are easily combined, fruit and vegetables is not as easily combined because of its more perishable nature.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay. So yeah, some nuances, I guess, there. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think as well, probably just to reflect on, I guess, the growth that the food service sector has been experiencing, as you mentioned before. And it's probably worth mentioning that through the Hortstats handbook for this most recent publication year for 2018-19, we were able to quantify and estimate the share of volume going to the food service sector in fresh form. And that was quite interesting. I think we saw volumes of around 17% across fruit and veg going to food service. I think there was 20% for vegetables and around 15% of fruit volume going to those food service channels, which is a fairly significant share of the volume. And I guess, to me, sort of some of the sound bites I've been hearing, sort of driving that volume share is concerning, people, with more disposable incomes looking to eat out and travel and attend events more. So obviously increasing the demand for food in that regard. Some drivers around convenience, and also, the food delivery as well. So are there any other kind of key characterizing sort of things that have kind of come to shape the food service sector for the sector?
No, it has grown. The proportion of household expenditure on food out of the home is now 35%. In 2010, it was about 26, 27. That's a pretty big increase when you consider the size of the market. That's moved from being spent, well, let's say if it was food consumed, it might have been spent elsewhere. Let's not get confused that $1 on food service does not translate to $1 in other channels. There's more cost involved in it. And that 70% is where we see it, but that wouldn't also take into account the processed or shelf-stable fruit and vegetables that go in there, which would still be another sizable component. That's really just the fresh stuff that we see and goes into that fresh market. And we're saying that's what channels towards food service as opposed to channeling towards the retail distribution.
So
And
yeah, so that wouldn't necessarily take into account things like, orange like juices or other sort of dried products and things like that as part of that
no,
volume share.
or,
Yeah.
or tinned or shelf stable or that sort of thing.
Yep.
The fresh
Of
product
course.
that has got that short life perishable on it. So there would be a reasonable proportion of, let's say, the ingredients they buy. And let's not lose sight of that. Food service is essentially a meal assembly operation. They buy ingredients and they assemble things, which is quite different to retail. What the retailers are doing is buying something and trading it. And they're looking at its trading merits, whereas the food service buyers are looking at its ease of being an ingredient and their meal assembly process. Different criteria.
Yep. Yep. That's very good to sort of have some of that in mind as we progress forward. I think,
Yeah.
I think now, like, obviously we've kind of got a bit of a perspective on sort of the state of play around what food service means and the way it comes to be expressed in the market. I think obviously I'm sure the audience are very interested to sort of understand, sort of some of the current market dynamics for the sector. Obviously, we've seen the significant impacts from COVID that it has brought, across many fronts. But Martin, I was hoping perhaps if we could maybe go to you and just to explore some of those areas in a little bit more detail around those impacts. So I think there's some material that we might be able to bring up there for you to sort of refer to. And I think it'd be fantastic just to take the audience through some of your perspectives, given you've been quite close to the surface with these issues.
Okay, thanks, Adam. So what we've got profiled here is, I suppose, just a quick snapshot of those channels, where that top group of cafes, restaurants, and takeaway is really what we call dining out or getting food delivered. That's a big part of it. That's about 70% of where the fruit and vegetable volumes go. Then we've got this other group, events, travel, and accommodation. That's about 7%, and 7 or 8%. And then you've got institutions, which are listed there, right from health through to military, correctional, workplace, and so on. They take about 20% of the volume. So in terms of the impacts of the current conditions, they have borne most heavily on events and travel and accommodation. Planes have been stopped, travel by car has been stopped, and all of those things that put people in places where they consumed food have basically been put on hold. They're only just starting to gear up now. So that channel was virtually reduced to nothing over a period of a couple of weeks, and it's only just regrouping now. The larger cafe, restaurant, and takeaway is what we call the dining out channel, has, I suppose, survived better by increases in the total channel in terms of takeaway. But the restaurants and the cafes within that have lost their ability to open, clearly compromised. And the lowest channel on that list there, the institutions, they've really maintained pretty much the same level, with the exception of education and a little bit of health, where elective surgery has been constrained and the big educational institutions have really only just reopened or are still working online. So that's sort of the status of where the current conditions affected those players and their relative contribution. Let's just go to what happened when the effects of, let's say, COVID landed. But prior to that, let's get probably take on board that this is a channel that was not traveling well. Okay, there were challenges, a lot of challenges meeting costs of labor, which are well publicized. There were challenges with enough margin to operate viably. And so when these things arrived, they were, I suppose, putting an unwelcome level of pressure on a lot of businesses that were struggling. There was a very, very sharp volume decline when you close the doors, which I don't think I've seen in my time in this food market. I haven't seen that type of directive go out there into the community and a direct impact. And there was stock losses immediately. as a result of that, anything that was fresh that was there, and they weren't allowed to trade. So pretty damning and pretty far-reaching, particularly for the restaurants that were only dealing with walk-in, sit-down customers. That left some, and as many as possibly could, shifting pretty quickly to shift in the focus. So they tried to move towards more servicing of what was going into the home. Certainly they availed themselves of the order aggregators, the Ubers and the menu logs and the Deliveroos were there, and those that weren't involved in some sort of into-home offer developed them. We had some of the top-end restaurants change their focus quite substantially in order to capture some of that and maintain some share. As a result of the changes, there was clearly levels of food service share transfer. Okay, retail at the moment, after the settling down of, let's say, the panic buying in March, and we got past that, which filled some pantries, then emptied some pantries a few weeks later. What we're seeing is that there's about 8% of the volume of what's going into retail at the moment has moved over from food service. That's how much they're up. Quite substantial, but not all. The online providers of meal kits and into-home deliveries have enjoyed substantial lifts to the points where some of them are challenged. Particularly the independent operators that were offering boxes into the home have done well, and that they may have enjoyed a window there where, under the pressure of dealing with the panic buying in March, the supermarkets, probably the two big supermarkets, wound back what they were doing with online, and that left a bit of a gap. And smaller independents stepped in, and they've held a bit of that share by our read. And there has been higher proportions of food prepared at home, and that's where it's landed. If people were eating out once or twice a week of an evening, that stopped. It might have found its way back in now, but that food still had to be purchased elsewhere. Now, in terms of share, let's talk about that for a minute. $1 in food service probably translates, if you're talking about it in retail, to about somewhere between 40 and 45 cents at retail. Okay, $1 spent at food service would probably represent maybe 30% of that would be the ingredients. If you took those ingredients at that price and put them into retail and marked them up, it's going to be about 45 or 50 cents for that. So $1 of food service does not translate to $1 in other channels. When in food service, it's still got labour and margin to be accommodated. Mm-hmm. As the order aggregators lifted their share, that brought increased pressure on the margin for the restaurants, which were not travelling with a lot of margin, I suppose, comfort level, and it actually stimulated the development of new alternatives, and that some of the people that were offering electronic ordering systems were quick enough to move them to give some of the restaurants the capacity to use those systems to deal direct, and alternatives to the mainstream order aggregators evolved. Okay. Across the fruit and vegetable product categories, those with high volumes, particularly, we've got some products that are 25 to 30% proportion of their volume going into food service, had more delicate wholesale market issues to resolve, and at times the wholesale markets reflected that supply pressure. Those that, particularly the products that were exposed to the fast food channels and the takeaway, which did pretty well, they seem to have ridden through that okay. The products that were more orientated towards dining out and, let's say, providing the plate appeal in the restaurants, they seem to have suffered more as a result. So I suppose in terms of and trying to add all that up, we've come back to saying what is what does the new normal look like? And we say that without trying to quote a popular buzzword, but we would be very, very surprised if food service evolved back to exactly what it was.
Mm-hmm.
So we think that understanding how we step towards that is important, because it's not just a question of it turning itself on again and being like where it was even in December last year, before the bushfire impact came and had its early sort of adverse impact. So the indicators that we'd suggest you look at are what's the restaurant patronage. I mean, the seating capacity in restaurants is going to be at the 30 or 40% region. What's the office population, particularly CBD areas? They're huge drivers of inner city food service patronage. What's the level of event attendance? What's the public transport usage? If people can't and aren't comfortable with public transport, then we're unlikely to populate CBD, and that's going to flow on to how quickly the recovery may come. And what's the petrol sales, which reflect car usage and reflect comfort, and maybe an indicator of international tourism finding its way back into local tourism spend. They're important things that we think will shape what new normal looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Adam, did that help?
No, that's really great. I think it just recognises the fact that, you know, there's so many co-founding factors at play that ultimately come to you know, influence the food service sector. And I think, as you've mentioned there, you know, looking at things like public transport as a potentially as a leading indicator, or you know, volume of petrol around people, you know, moving around and about. I think it's one thing if we're, you know, lifting restrictions, so to speak, as we've seen, you know, come about. But it's the other thing is to actually consider how that translates, you know, into people's activity and actions around that. So I think it was also really, really good to get that breakdown around the channels and to know that dining out and those affiliated services represent around 70% of the entire market there for food service. I think, you know, certainly demonstrates the amount of exposure that we've faced in that regard. So yeah, I think I'm hearing that it's certainly still very much a watching brief, and it's around understanding how those, you know, where these new behaviours and new patterns come out from this whole event. I might just mention that I'd encourage, we haven't had many questions lodged yet in the Q&A. So I mean, if based off the back of Martin's call, I'd encourage anyone, if you've got any questions off what you've seen or what you've heard today, please put those forward. I might jump in, Martin, just with a couple of other ones that I've come to get from there. So I mean, in terms of recovery, like, where do we see things coming back to? I know we spoke around indicators, but in your perspective, what's your view on where food service is likely to land once we kind of get past where we're at the moment? Do you have any perspectives there for us?
That's a difficult, very difficult question, given that we've gone through a phase where we've closed everything, we're starting to open it, and what we don't know yet is consumer comfort, whether they're interested, whether they can. What we know is that restaurants are going to be able to seat while social distancing indication in place at around about 30-40%. And so if food service, we know that takeaway is up. We know that the volumes through Uber, Deliveroo and Minilog are about 30% up on where they were, and we know that more restaurants are doing more takeaways, particularly the suburban ones. We know the CBD is finding it more challenging. Lots of variables in there. I mean, if it came back in the next 3 months to be 60% of where it was, I think we'd be doing very well. We'd be doing very well because there are still a lot of unknowns in that, not the least of which is just the seating capacity for the restaurants. Institutions are solid, they'll carry on. So there's a solid 20%. Yeah. But the dining out and the travel component, I mean, we're seeing, we're not seeing travel turned on really, really quickly. And we're not even sure if the travel is turned on, whether part of that service might comfortably include providing food.
Sure. Okay. Well, that's, I mean, might be a long road to a place that certainly wasn't where it used to be, potentially.
No.
I think something as well would just be any perspectives on what we've been seeing from overseas, because obviously we're not alone here in Australia around these impacts. But yeah, is there anything we can glean from the experience overseas around the disruption?
Yeah, it's
What that might
probably
look
best
like?
to take a similar market like outside. Like the Kiwis opened up 3 or 4 weeks ago and enjoyed a strong burst of patronage in the restaurants and the cafes, and they got a very strong lift in that. I would imagine that we will get something similar, to the extent of which it's really quite hard to read. In the US, where there is a far higher proportion of food spent out of home, they're having lots of trouble, because the volume of that food was too much for the retail channel, and so there is food that's not finding its way through. And you've still got, because of conditions, and I think the status of the virus, you've still got people more hesitant than not coming out. So it's kind of hard to find a set of conditions where we're as lucky as what we are, and the Kiwis are the best sort of benchmark at the moment.
Fair enough. We've had a couple of questions come up here, Martin. So I might just throw here. So are we? I might just answer this one live here. So it's around the lift in online fruit and veg, as we touched on before. And do you think this is going to look like it might be a bit of a permanent sort of foundation that could be growing from this disruption that we've seen in Layu of where that food service volume is coming from?
I think the people that have sought the online option may not have been buyers of that type of service before, and if they've had a good experience, there's every chance that share will stay with those channels. Just bear in mind what's happened. If it's been the local providers who have picked up that share, it's solved their biggest problem, because they've either got someone home when they deliver it, or they've been given the okay to leave it somewhere, which is their biggest headache. And if they've picked up more customers, they're probably in the same proximity. So 2 or 3 things that have played to the business model of online have fallen into place. So I'd be very surprised if those small operators weren't investing heavily to keep that. And I think they will.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, that's, I guess, potentially a good news
Yeah.
story for those smaller guys who are able to tap into those opportunities and move quickly.
Yes.
Which I think is really good. Now, there's just one other one. I know we're kind of coming to closing stages, so it might just be time for one more question here, and that's, I guess, looking overall around if retail is going to sort of pick up some of this slack. So I know we spoke before, Martin, around that transfer there. So the question is if food service doesn't come back to levels previously seen, does the retail market make up the leftover, or are we likely to see overall declines in volumes that we're clearing through the market?
The volume of the food is the volume of the food. It's going to need to be sourced to be consumed. Bear in mind that that dollar in food service has probably got 60 cents of margin and labour in it as well. So, but that volume still has to be consumed, and retail is clearly picking up some share, and in our view, will probably hold more share, because I think that all of food service, all of it back to 100% of where it was, is more unlikely than not. And you've got to qualify that by, we really don't know what the next 3 or 4 months is going to reveal. So I don't think the market contracts in terms of the volume it consumes. It just finds its way through to another channel, although there are some products that will not find it as easy to have their value acknowledged in trying to divert their volume through to retail. For instance, products that deliver the aesthetics of plate appeal for dining out are going to be challenged to find that same sort of demand through retail.
Definitely. That's, yeah, okay. Well, I guess, yeah, good to know. I think I'm just conscious of the time here. We've smack bang up on time. So I think what we might do is just before everyone signs off, there's a poll that we're just going to launch here just to elicit some feedback on the event. So it'd be really appreciated for those on the line if you could just go through that. Just helps us to make sure we're tailoring these events that give the best value back to you. Martin, I think it's been really great to take us through some of those overall indicators and what to look for. I think particularly has been really enlightening to see, and obviously it's still very much a moving space at the moment with quite a few unknowns. But I think certainly I think the key thing obviously is food service is going to certainly look very different in the future than what it was, at the start of 2020. So I guess some challenges, but also as we've seen through the likes of online delivery and small platforms in that regard, potentially some opportunities for those who are well placed to act on that. So thanks, Martin, for joining us and for sharing your insights with us today. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, no problem.
No problems, guys. We'll leave it there. Before we sign off, we are going to make this webinar available online through the recording. So check that out, and we're also going to be looking to deliver these insights series into the future. So keep an eye out on email as well. So thanks again for your time and for your engagement today, everybody, and look forward to speaking with you soon.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Cheers. Bye.
See you guys. Thank you.